Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And then Jesus sent his disciples out into the world, and somewhere along the way, we forgot where we were going. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the Apartheid Museum in South Africa. I was there for a conference, just in and out in 3 or 4 days, not really a very bright move, but I was younger then. Fortunately, just before I left for the airport, I spent the morning touring the museum. While I had known the broad brushstrokes of apartheid, I'll admit that embarrassingly I didn't know very many of the specifics, but as I toured the exhibit, they came out at me. It told a story, a compelling story, about a small minority white group that through policy and violence segregated an entire people. Apartheid determined almost every aspect of one's life, from where you could live, to who you could marry, to how you could worship, to whether or not you had a voice. Apartheid, see, literally meant apartness or aparthood in Afrikaans. And as I went through the exhibits, I couldn't help but think, perhaps from my frame of reference, unsurprisingly, I couldn't help but ask myself the same question over and over again: where were the Christians? The answer, of course, was too often silent. Sure, I had known that violence could be committed by silent Christians. No one over the last 80 years who has involved themselves into a church has been able to stop asking the question, how could the church be silent in the face of the attempted extermination of 6 million Jews in Europe? How could they forget that Jesus himself was a Jew? Why didn't they speak out? Why didn't they stand up? Why didn't they lay down their own lives? Some did, of course. We remember people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but the truth is, they were few and far between. I had known cognitively that that was the case, that churches could be silent, that Christians could be silent in that, but this felt a little more tangible, a little more visceral. After all, apartheid only ended in 1994. I was still in high school. Which meant, of course, that at least in theory, some of those Christians were still sitting in their very same pews, singing the very same hymns that they were singing, oblivious, if not indifferent, to the pain, to the harm they had caused. Evil works that way sometimes, doesn't it? It often shows up in its Sunday best. So often we think of it as overt action, but the truth is, more often than not, evil comes from the absence of action, from the failure to do good. No, one of the hard truths of this world is that we can do harm simply by failing to do good. We, of all people, should know. We've experienced it over the last few weeks, haven't we? We've begun to recognize the harm that can come by failing to do good. The truth is, the Black Lives Matter movement isn't new. The injustices towards which it points didn't just pop overnight. No, they've been brewing for at least the last 400 years. Only too many people who look like me have failed to see it. We've convinced ourselves, of course, that so long as we don't have any personal racist feelings, at least overt or explicit, so long as we don't drive through those neighborhoods, so long as that isn't our experience, it must not actually be true, as if our experience was the only experience. And then came the global pandemic. As so often happens, that sickness revealed the deeper disease, a kind of self-inflicted apartheid, apartness that we've allowed to brew. We've allowed to take root in our society and dismiss as normal. In almost every aspect of our lives, we've grown accustomed to apartness, racially, politically, religiously, socially. And maybe before the pandemic, we could pretend like it was normal, like that growing rift between you and me, between us and them, between who we are and who we long to be, was normal. We could convince ourselves that it was okay to just listen to the news from the station that already agrees with us. We could convince ourselves that it was probably better to just be around people who thought like us, who looked like us, who voted like us. We could almost, if we really tried, convince ourselves that what we did didn't really affect too many others. It's hard to overstate just how wrong we've been. Whether we know it or not, friends, the paradigm has shifted. Something has changed. Sure, over the last few months, we have attempted to continue to do things as we always have, to problem solve in our partisan way, and as per usual, it has only led to more problems, only this time with much more dire consequences. Now our mistrust of facts, our disinformation, our failure at the highest levels of leadership haven't just caused figurative death. No. Now people have literally died for our dysfunction. To be sure, some would have died regardless. That's the nature of a pandemic. That's the nature of this sickness. But let us not hide the fact that more have died because of our inability to even admit that there is a problem. From our inability to come together and solve something together, recognizing that this is at least one moment that we all face it, and because of that apartheid, that apartness that we've allowed to fester in our society, because of the inequalities and injustices that we've allowed to continue to exist, the truth is, the least among us suffer the most. It's not hard to imagine someone walking through a museum 20 years from now, looking back, shaking their heads, and asking the question, where were the Christians? If nothing else, this pandemic has exposed the distance between where we are and where we long to be. The vast disparities that exist between people for no other reason than the color of their skin or the amount in their bank account. It's shown us just how disparate that is, the difference between what we profess to believe and how we actually act. We have seen what that does. In almost every aspect of our lives, we know that it has been true. As individuals, as a country, as a church, as Christians, we understand that it's true, but it had also given us some hope, because in recognizing where we are, we can make a change. If nothing else, the pandemic has held up a mirror, a hard mirror for us to look into, but a mirror nonetheless. And once we see it, we can begin to make some changes. There are those out there who say all we need to do is go back to a moment in which we were great. If we can just become great again, then things will be solved. But try as we might, we can't pinpoint that moment. We can't find our way back to that specific moment in which everything was great. Sure, there have been moments of fleeting greatness even in this country. Each of us could likely point to a few. But have we ever been truly great? Or said another way, has it ever been great for all? We know the answer. That was the idea in the beginning, though. Here we are on the eve of our 244th birthday as a nation. Perhaps it makes sense before we look out of those amber waves of grain and celebrate the purple mountain's majesty to at least take a really hard look at what we were trying with this American experiment. We can hear the idea of greatness in it. It's right there in our founding document, the one that we'll haul out of storage on Saturday, the one that begins simply, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We, of course, join the Schuyler sisters in compelling them to include women in the sequel, but the idea itself, at its core, is good. That all are created equal. It doesn't say that there's no differences. Even they knew that that was not the case. In other words, it's not claiming that we're all the same, merely equal. That no person by virtue of their personhood is worth any more than the others. Of course, they failed almost right away. Need we recall the 3/5 person clause? But the idea at its core was right, that all are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, the rights among them to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not just good, that is essentially Christian. So maybe the question we ought to be asking ourselves as we approach our 244th birthday as a country is, how do we get from here to there? And maybe as Christians, the question we ought to ask ourselves is, how can we help? And maybe as individuals, the question we ought to be asking ourselves is, what do we need to change to get there? That's the thing. At this moment, in almost every aspect of our lives, we're all asking the same question. How do we traverse the distance between who we are and who we long to be? How do we build a world that is more equitable for all? How do we make sure that all actually are able to achieve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? The good news is that our faith can help. Believe it or not, Christians weren't meant to be a part of the problem. When Christ sent us out in the world, He meant for us to act in such a way that was worthy of welcome. That's why He told us, whoever welcomes you, welcomes me. Because He assumed we would go out and live in a way worthy of welcome. When He sent us out, it wasn't to mess things up. It was to make the world a better place, to literally save the world, not from death, but to life. The kind of life that not even death can destroy, the kind of life that begins right now in this moment, not at death, but right here. He was even kind enough to show us the way. How do we change the world? One relationship at a time. That's all we can do. He showed us the way. Think of the way He lived His life. He met each person He encountered, and in the particularity of that encounter, He met them where they were and treated them as if they were already where they longed to be. Not where He longed for them to be, but where they longed for them to be, at their very center. He met them in that concrete moment, not in the abstract, with the smell of life upon them, with all of the brokenness and imperfection, and then treated them as if they were already where they long to be, as if they were already their best selves. Howard Thurman says that is the nature of love. We meet the other person where they are, and we treat them as if they are already where they long to be. That is our call. It takes courage. It takes courage to open our eyes and to actually see the person, not the idea of the person. It takes courage to look into their eyes, to acknowledge the pain that perhaps we have caused, to acknowledge the pain that they're sitting in, and then imagination, to envision something different, to see them for the fulfillment of their possibility. Maybe we could try it. Courage and imagination. It's not going to help us to ignore the problem. It's not going to help us to look and pretend like we don't actually see it, like it's not really there, as if somehow we're not really a part of the problem. The truth is, friends, we are. And until we can acknowledge our own culpability in this, our own complicity in this, our own racism, until we can acknowledge that, we can't move on. So let us start by acknowledging where we are, meeting ourselves where we are, and then trying to believe something else, to move into something else. Christ stood in the center. In the distance, it became a bridge between who we are and who we long to be. Let us stand with him. Maybe that would help us break down that self-inflicted apartheid we'd placed on ourselves, that apartness that has become so normal. Maybe that will help us find that world in which all are truly and finally entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I got a ride to the airport from the Apartheid Museum from a white professor and minister. He hadn't been into the museum. It turns out he went once a month, but never with anyone else. It was just too emotional. And as I sat in the car talking with him about the experience, he grew more and more silent until finally I asked him, "What was it like?" He began slowly to confess that at the beginning, he didn't know anything was wrong. That growing up, he learned that apartheid was just a part of the natural order, that it was almost a mutually beneficial notion. Sure, he had known of the shanty towns, but didn't spend much time driving by them. It's amazing what a wall can do. He came to success in ministry and in the academy at the height of apartheid. And by virtue of his whiteness, never said much about it. Maybe we know the feeling. Then in 1980, he was invited to be a special guest lecturer for a short-term course in Texas. And as he went out to that Texas seminary and was speaking each day, he stayed in a hotel room, and finally one night he turned on the news and a world report on apartheid came on. He saw pictures he had never seen before and heard stories he had never heard. And at first he was indignant. He did not believe what he saw. He shook his head, said, "This isn't the home that I'm used to. This isn't South Africa. That's not really happening." But the longer he watched, the more he realized that not only was he wrong, but it was true. It took coming around the world to finally get a full view of his neighbors. And once he knew it was true, as a Christian, there was no looking back. Though he didn't tell me, I learned upon my return that he had become one of the leading Christian voices against apartheid after he knew. Maybe, friends, this is our moment. Maybe this pandemic is an opportunity for us to pause from our normal routines and in that separateness finally find that togetherness we have so lacked for so long. Maybe this is our moment to finally bridge that gap between who we are and who we long to be. Maybe this is our moment to tear down the walls of our self-inflicted apartheid. Maybe this is the moment for us to answer the call of Christ, and in so doing find that the truth will set us all free. Only one way to find out. May it be so. Amen.